fellowship is set up for people in the community, a lot of marginalised people, psychiatric people, people with different perhaps kinds of disabilities in some kinds of ways. A lot of that is financial disabilities. But the fellowship is there to gather them together as a family.
Telling the old people, because I go visit the old people in the homes, about Delta. And you know what? I've laid hand on some of those elderly people, and some of them have been healed in the name of...
Buy a funeral home, they buy the goodwill too. They retain the original name. Normal business practice, but it irks some independent funeral directors. They say it means customers can't tell that anything's changed. In fact, when the Americans started buying in Christchurch, whispers got around that they'd bought the company managed by Wayne Lyons, too. So he put an advert in the paper, just to point out they hadn't. Why would people even think that you sold out?
Rumours. Rumours are right. They're everywhere. It's a very small industry, the funeral industry.
The rumours and suspicion aren't helped by the fact that Stewart Enterprises isn't the name that the company uses in this country. Instead, it called National Care Services, or Funeral Services of New Zealand, or Funeral Services of Australasia. And this whole question of the name of the company and its businesses rankles with their own association rulebook says that the true business name of the member will be shown, or at least given some mention.
Yes, that is one of the questions that has been addressed to us by our members, and it is one of the questions that we are addressing with the company as an executive at the moment.
And you guys are going to get...
But should the president of the Funeral Directors Association be doing more? Should he and his members be trying to halt the American advance? Jessica Mitford would have thought so. She won world renown for her bestseller, The American Way of Death, in which she warned of a US takeover.
How I would characterize it is as a very predatory kind of business gone wild, really gone wild, that preys on the grief of people.
Mitford, whose own funeral took place last year, wrote back in the 60s that the Americans had created a grotesque cloud cuckoo land where the trappings of gracious living are transformed into gracious dying. Researcher Karen Leonard had been helping Mitford to write a sequel, and she's about to publish the result of their joint effort. She warns that New Zealand won't escape the Americans' predatory business.
It is going to be just sheep flocking in areas and countries where the populace aren't prepared, and you don't have any legislation already put up there to protect the consumer.
We're going to be fleeced?
Oh, most definitely, most definitely.
Fleeced or not, there's no doubt the Americans do have a different way of death. They're not shy of merchandising, offering plenty of choice. You only have to visit an ordinary American funeral parlor to see what's available.
Hi, nice to meet you.
You can have a starlit service.
The ceiling is the constellation at the time of the resurrection of Christ, which gives it a feeling, a positive feeling.
A video presentation, or a living memory picture, as they call it, to show the relatives.
The video is very uplifting.
A more fitting urn for the ashes, or cremains as they're known.
$1,495. There's one for $75.
National Care Services, or Funeral Services of New Zealand, or Funeral Services of Australasia. And this whole question of the name of the company and its businesses rankles with... Temple down here.
Yeah.
2,700.
Mm-hmm.
For the men. Appropriate attire for the departed.
Right. The women's like a lingerie for some reason.
And most importantly, a quality coffin.
People want to go with quality. This is their chance, their last chance to pay respects to their loved one and to make a purchase with that person in mind.
Okay, so this home's by no means extravagant. It's independently owned by a woman called Kim Hill, and it caters for the black community in a suburb of Los Angeles. But the coffins, or caskets, start at just under $1,000 US. So these would be on the cheap side, 1,800.
We wouldn't use the word cheap, but
I'm sorry.
they are
Well, they're
lesser
not cheap.
priced.
They're not cheap.
They're reasonably, what we think is reasonably priced.
In fact, I suppose a cheap one would be just the traditional strip pine coffin.
Which is something that I've never seen.
Doesn't exist.
No. I'm sure that it exists, but I've never seen it. Again, with tradition, our families seem to like to choose a metal casket.
Traditions in America set in quick, and some consider it quite traditional to go for the top of the range, the Promethean. Of course, the higher the price, the greater the profit. And this is the expensive, can I use that word?
You can use
one?
that word. This is expensive, $24,000.
What's it made of?
It's a polished bronze. They polish it out, buff it out until it has this gold tone to it.
And for those who wouldn't be seen dead in anything so ordinary, there's the Egyptian look. Can people really order that?
They can. They can.
Up to now, the funeral business in New Zealand has been a touch more austere than that. Dignity with Sincerity, for example, is based in an industrial area of Christchurch. Its coffins are out the back and start at just 300 New Zealand dollars for a simple chipboard box. Cheryl Cowden says she has been approached by a representative of Stewart Enterprises with a view to purchase.
He just said we would have to have a casket display room, and on the caskets, in fact, the top range caskets would be shown to the families first, and then they would be shown the standard caskets. And the reason behind that was that it's very hard to change your mind when you've seen the best. It's really awful. I mean, it's not the way I want to have my funeral company run.
Stewart Enterprises refused to be interviewed on camera about their New Zealand activities, but responded to a written inquiry saying, "We have not made such comments." We tried to talk to managers of Stewart's owned homes, but they too wouldn't comment. This one in Masterton was bought last year. A keen young New Zealand undertaker, David Dew, had wanted to buy it, but he says he didn't have the sort of money that Stewarts were prepared to stump up. So he started his own rival company just down the road.
I think that the resolve of the Stewart Group was to purchase, and they offered a good portion above what was the going rate.
They obviously think there's some profits to be made here.
Oh, undoubtedly there are.
There are profits to be made, partly because the death rate in New Zealand is tipped to start soaring, from 22,000 a year now to almost double that in 40 years' time. Partly also, critics of the death care industry say firms like Stewart's should find it easy to make money in a country unused to competition like New Zealand.
They've paid too much for the homes to begin with, if not at least double. They've got to recoup those losses. So they'll begin raising prices, first and foremost.
How do you raise prices in a free market? Presumably they go out of business.
Well, I don't know that there is such a thing as a free market. I mean, where do you get a shopping guide on casino? It's very difficult to have any knowledge about. So usually when Martha or George dies, they usually go to the funeral home. They always think that the closest mortuary is the one that they did Uncle Bob back when 14 years ago or so. They don't know that it's now owned by a conglomerate. They don't know that the prices have changed dramatically since then. And once the body is there, what are you going to do, even if you don't agree with paying the high price?
A new florist that
in the United States, we did manage to secure a rare interview with a senior Stewart's representative, Skip Notke.
Do they choose from this picture?
He wouldn't comment about the company's New Zealand business, but he said in America, a Stewart's takeover isn't necessarily a trigger for higher prices.
No, actually it's not, because in places where prices have gone up, regardless of who has owned the firms, all that it does is create a marketplace for someone who's willing and able to provide services at a lower cost to open a firm and compete with them on a price basis.
Do grieving relatives really shop around? Do they compare prices?
We find in the United States that yes, you do. Absolutely.
One of Stewart's latest American acquisitions, the Strickland Snively Funeral Home in Los Angeles. The vendor, Randy Strickland, owner of 3 such parlours, got an offer he didn't refuse. Did you get a reasonable price for the business?
Yes, I did.
Any idea? Can you give us any idea?
No, but it was a very fair price, and we had been approached by other companies as well that were interested in acquiring our funeral homes, and Stewart made a very fair offer. This would be a place where we'd have a visitation. This is where we'd have the viewing of the body.
Randy Strickland will stay on for a while to manage the firm he's just sold. The idea is to maintain links with the community. Local people, according to Stewart's, have nothing to fear.
My family sold our firm 13 years ago to Stewart Enterprises. And when we did so, we chose Stewart because we were assured then by Frank Stewart, who is the chairman of our board, that we would be allowed to make the decisions on a local basis as to the services that we would provide, the prices that we would for community. I can tell you for the last 13 years that that's exactly what's happened, and it continues to happen today. My supposing in New Zealand or any of the other countries that we are.
Do we have nothing to fear? After the break, we hear claims of rip-offs in the funeral industry in America.
These things explode, and body parts are blown out of the caskets.
Began making coffins. He'd fell trees, bring them down river, fashion the coffins by hand, and then put on a service. His son Bruce used to help.
The New Zealand tradition, and people still come in here and ask for Percy Graham, which was my father, and that's how the name of the business goes.
I still get called Percy by some of the local Maori folk. Come to Percy Graham, he'll look after you. Yep.
Bruce now runs the business with his wife Lynn and his son Mark, who will eventually succeed him as boss. They all believe the family tradition is important.
People really appreciate the fact that you're really caring for them. We certainly will continue to be a family-orientated business that provides a very personal level of service.
Percy's descendants, too, see the funeral industry as a public service, a noble profession with the highest standards. After 9 years in the business, Mark Graham is still learning the finer points. He's so dedicated, he travels to Wellington for funeral directors' training courses.
Hi, Bob. Thanks. Sit down. Thank you. No, I'm fine, thanks, Bob.
This session, a role play, how to approach the deceased's relatives, even when they're a bit tipsy.
Your old mother died after a long life.
You can say it was in my blood or whatever, but yeah, here I am, and it's a very interesting job.
What does it mean when you go to a party, though, and you say you're a funeral director?
Oh, you get the usual jokes, and...
like what?
Oh, you know...
Business is dead, gee, that's stiff.
Of course, we shouldn't overplay the integrity of the New Zealand funeral business. It is the Christchurch funeral scene was in disarray. Peter Lawrence was setting up an alternative, largely low-cost service, and says the then-established firms shut him out, stopped him getting supplies. He, in turn, was accused of stealing some of the things he needed. It hasn't always been caring and sharing here. There's been a bit of argy-bargy here, hasn't there?
Occasionally. No, not really. Overall, we get on very well with the other funeral directors.
Lawrence now runs a large and respectable business. But that's not the only trouble there's been in Christchurch. When Cheryl Cowden set up her all-woman home 2 years ago, she says some elements in the industry didn't like the competition.
Strange things were happening, like the funeral home was broken into. I had pellet bullet holes put through the windows, a window smashed in, my car broken into at home, my computer was stolen, and also my funeral suit. I wear tails, they're tailor-made tails and a pinstripe skirt, and there were 2 things taken, and those 2 things were taken. And if you wanted to cripple a business, they would be your attire that you wore and your computer with all your information on.
But however troublesome the business has been in New Zealand, nothing in our past compares with the cutthroat competition in the United States. There, saturation advertising bombards the potential customer. The adverts urge them to opt for burial.
Many people choose Forest Lawn because of the wide variety of memorial property available, from regular ground property to lawn crypts,
They extol the benefits of dissemination at sea.
Our cremation prepayment plans have created a guaranteed price by prepaying the cost, thereby taking away not only the emotional strain, but also the financial burden from the family.
Now there's even the chance to have your ashes placed in a capsule and sent into space. The funeral business is so cutthroat that US television programs almost routinely expose shady dealings in the death care world.
Looking to make a big...
All of them feature a crusading priest, Father Henry Wasilewski, who's become famous for his no-holds-barred campaign against funeral malpractice.
All this is going on all day long, every day, every mortuary.
Every mortuary?
Every mortuary. It's ripping off every family.
The rip-offs? Well, one of his more bizarre complaints concerns the popularity of the hermetically sealed metal coffin, the sort sold by Stewart's in Los Angeles and just about every other funeral home in the States.
Well, they want the remains to be protected from outside elements. You know, that's their desire, but we don't make a big thing about it. It's just one of the options.
Does the body stay intact with a seal like that?
Oh, no. You know, the body will eventually decay. That's God's plan.
Every mortuary is going to try and sell you a sealer casket with a rubber gasket. These things destroy the body. These things cause the anaerobic bacteria to go to work on the body, to liquefy the body parts, to build up enormous gas pressure, and then if the temperature's right, especially in a mausoleum, these things explode and body parts are blown out of the caskets. And every mortuary, every mortician in the United States knows this.
Father Henry Wasilewski has even angered church leaders by claiming his fellow clergy take bribes from funeral directors in exchange for handing out advertising material to their congregations.
Like one mortician in our neighborhood here who just gave $5,000 to each of 4 pastors. And then right afterwards he asked them to pass out his calendars. And, you know, if the mortician is really lucky, the pastor may even say to the people, we want to thank the Jones Mortuary for their wonderful gift of these calendars today.
The reality is that if a clergyman, first of all, would enter into such agreement, I would have be very disappointed in the clergyman. I'd be more disappointed in the funeral director who would be involved in something like that. We're entrusted by the customers who choose us. And for someone to, in some way, deceive that family is preposterous in my mind.
Less preposterous are Father Henry's charges of price manipulation. From the back room of his little flat in Phoenix, Arizona, he monitors funeral directors' prices. He says some have a number of different price lists and decide to use the expensive one if their customers look rich.
They decide, let's use price list D on this family. And it's completely different than price list A. But it has all the casket prices on there too. So what they do is the guy says, pardon me for a second, he goes to his secretary and says, change all the casket prices on the caskets to match price list D. So when the family gets in there, everything matches.
Stewart's have not been accused of this sort of price fixing, but they were recently charged by the US Federal Trade Commission with failing to display price lists. Stewart's, though they denied guilt, did make a substantial settlement payment. And they now seem sensitive about the whole issue.
The moment that an individual enters one of our funeral homes and begins asking questions about prices and products and services, I'm actually obligated to present to you a general price list. We're not doing that right now simply because this is not a discussion of a funeral, but in fact an interview about our industry. I hope you'll understand.
For years, this sort of competition was out of place in the funeral business, which developed at its own natural rate, the rate at which people were dying. But no longer. It's now expanding fast, thanks to one thing, the pre-arranged funeral, pre-need as it's known. Is this one way that you can grow the business? Younger people?
We can attract people who are in the prime of their life, absolutely.
Forrest Lawn's years of experience in
American funeral companies chase the pre-need dollar with great zeal. Already around 18% of their revenue is from pre-need funerals. In the end, they expect that to get up to 75%. It's big business, and the American firms employ squads of salespeople.
They have a technique where they will put in all the newspapers an ad in the employment section for people getting great commissions, easy sales, things that would lure the locals in with people who are looking for money, especially young people. And what they will do is they will give them a quota of how many crypts and how many graves and etc. that they can sell. Well, these people are going to obviously sell to all their friends and family first to meet that quota.
Free need.
Free need. This is before they die. And the moment that that market's dried up, they're fired.
They're fired.
They're gone.
As we'll see, in Australia, the Americans have bought up large, and pre-need is huge. There are allegations of aggressive marketing. Some claim the Australian industry has begun to sell its soul.
They wanted us to make a sale, for sure. Yes, as many sales as possible. In fact, sales, and more sales.
Investing around 4 years ago. Today, 2 American companies, Stewart's and Service Corporation International, are believed to have already cornered at least half of the market. In fact, in certain areas, the independent Australian owners say they feel beleaguered. Tony Jeffrey is one of them. He says you can tell the Americans are starting to take over just by glancing through the Sydney Yellow Pages.
Service Corporation International, which is White Ladies. Service Corporation Simplicity. Stewart's, which is Gregory and Carr. Service Corporation International. Service Corporation International.
Some days they might have anything between 50 to 60 to 80 to 100 bodies here in this place.
What, just waiting to be buried?
Yes, just waiting.
Do you have anything like this?
Nope. No.
Do you want something like this?
No. Nope.
Why not?
Because you lose your... I think you lose your dignity. I don't think it's the right way as far as funerals are concerned. I don't think people realise that the bodies are going to this enormous place.
Death, something we will all deal with. Jeffrey Brothers Funeral.
Of course, the independent funeral homes, like Jeffrey's, have every reason to knock the opposition. They admit it's harder to compete when the American companies have such economies of scale, but they insist they're concerned only with the reputation of their profession.
We will assist you in tailoring a service to suit your taste and budget.
The industry here in Australia was very, very quiet, you know what I mean? We were always very gentle with people. There wasn't this hard sell like it is today.
Service Corporation International, SCI, wouldn't be interviewed about its Australian activities. We went to the annual convention of the Australian Funeral Directors Association, some of whose prominent members are managers of American-owned homes. We were to have interviewed the association's executive director there, but he decided against. Instead, we got a written statement saying that adherence to professional ethical standards is and should be fundamental. Ownership is of little consequence. The truth is, the Australian industry is super sensitive to criticism of its ethical standards, and it's had no shortage of criticism. The very evening of their convention lunch, another television expose.
And they're set to grab more of the market, but it's the way they do business that's causing quite a stir.
Part of the problem is that the American companies didn't exactly advertise their arrival in Australia. This is an early newspaper advert placed by a Stewart's own parlour, the word Australian prominent. The ad's no longer being used.
I don't believe that companies...
In Brisbane, heads the Association of Australian-owned Funeral Directors, formed to raise awareness of the American presence.
It's not unusual when you're talking to people and you reveal the fact that the Americans are here and they didn't know. They just look at you incredulously and say, look, do you mean to say we don't even bury our own dead anymore?
But you do. It's Australians who are working for the American companies who bury the dead.
That's true, but where are the decisions made? 12,000 kilometres away.
One of the mainstays of SCI's Australian investment is the White Ladies chain. All women dressed in white, with white hearses and white accessories.
Initially, we didn't like the idea, but they've brought have come with them.
But American caskets?
Yes. And people look at those caskets not as expensive, they look at them as being more comfortable, more traditional for, you know, ethnic groups, things like that. If they're having viewings in caskets like that, Mum looks much better.
To make life even more comfortable for funeral shoppers, the White Ladies offer a wide range of death accessories, from fancy handles to personalised coffins. The same sort of variety is now available at crematoria, a number of which are now also American-owned. The Mount Thompson Crematorium in Brisbane was bought by SCI. A sales team here is employed to sell memorial spaces to people before they die. Pre-need selling is now big business.
Once the American company got control of the 2 crematoria in Brisbane, they brought their sales teams in and started working through all the records, contacting as many people as they possibly could to encourage them to upgrade their memorials, pre-sell them things like plaques and memorials, and so that's why they like to get hold of those businesses.
Some who used to work for the Americans in Brisbane are critical of their former employers. Bob Hurst, a former Kiwi, now works for an Australian-owned crematorium. He used to sell pre-need memorials at Mount Thompson, but he claims he did SCI's sales tactics, refused to go along with them, and left 2 months ago.
Their methods are to go out and talk to people who are elderly, very vulnerable. Majority of them have either lost their husband or their wife. They would be in their late 60s to their late 90s. A very vulnerable situation, and when you've gone and are talking to somebody who is elderly like that, who has lost a loved spouse or something like that, it is very easy to get them and put the guilt on that person. And that was what they used to say: if you can get a tear in the eye, you will get the contract signed.
To get the tear in the eye, Bob Hurst claims he was asked to make his sales pitch like this.
Mary, you're now on your own.
In your loving mercy, grant him pardon and peace.
You now have a decision to make in regards to the funeral. This will be at a very stressful time in your life. Would you not rather do this now than do it later?
Ashes to ashes.
What is going to happen when your time comes?
Dust to dust.
I strongly recommend to you that you do this today.
Salespeople at Mount Thompson are paid on a commission-only basis. Some former staff say that meant there was a strong financial incentive to make a sale.
If you don't make sales, you don't make a living. You starve at the end of the week.
Glyn Richards says he and others actually went out door-to-door selling pre-need services before he too walked off the job.
My name's Glenn, and I'm from the Mount Thompson Memorial Gardens. You need a fair bit of compassion and to go around people's houses talking about funerals and death, especially if you knocked on a door when somebody had just buried their loved one. Very good timing. And is your husband...
We put questions to SCIs in writing. Their response? Our employees are trained to reflect the company's commitment to ensuring families are dealt with fairly and honestly and within consumer protection laws. Will Kiwis get to enjoy SCI's customer service? Well, the company has investigated investment opportunities in New Zealand, but decided against at this stage. One of the problems may be that most of our crematoria are council-owned and not for sale. Some already offer pre-arranged memorials, but a crematorium like the Manukau Memorial Gardens wouldn't dream of going out selling pre-need.
It's just an option that's available, but not marketed as such.
You can make a bit of money out of that.
No, we're not here to make money. We provide a social service, really.
Of course, that's not to say American companies can't get into the cremation business in New Zealand. Stewarts could do what they're doing in Queensland, build their own from scratch. Nearby, on the outskirts of Brisbane, is a crematorium and memorial gardens owned by a former Dunedinite, Phil Connolly. Connolly says New Zealanders should beware. Competition will increase. Pre-arranged funerals and memorials will become commonplace, he says, and we shouldn't resist. He didn't. He set up his own pre-need sales team.
We have to compete with the Americans on their same basis as what they're doing it.
I mean, if we don't sell pre-need funerals and they do sell pre-need funerals, there'll be nothing for us 10 years' time down the track. Everybody will have a funeral that's been sold to them before. If the people are willing and want it, and there's a need there, I think we should fulfil that need.
And New Zealand funeral directors maybe should get into the same business then, do you think?
I'd strongly advise it, because if they don't, there'll be nothing left for them.
Is New Zealand ready for the funereal future? Can we compete with the international merchants of death? That's next. New Zealanders to keep up with the trends. Designer police coffins are on show this year. And for $100,000, there are new ways to stretch and stylize your station wagon.
So that's a door where you can put your church wheels and that sort of thing when you go to a church, that you've got to have wheels to put the coffin on in the church.
Oh, right.
And that sort of thing. And then you've got a lift-up side like that, where you're able to get access to putting flowers in around the coffin.
Do you think the customers really mind whether they've got a fancy hearse or not?
Yeah, I think so. I think people like to think that their family have been finished, or that loved person has been finished in a very dignified manner and finished in a nice prestigious way.
There's a sparkling array of implements now available for preserving and dressing the deceased.
What they actually do is they remove the blood and the bodily fluids, and they replace them with a hardening compound and the preservation sort of fluid.
There are deodorizers, unguents, and corpse-friendly cosmetics.
These type of cosmetics are made especially for the deceased. They have a certain quality to them that sticks to the skin a lot better than a normal cosmetic. When you haven't got any moisture in your skin, which you don't after death, these type of cosmetics will adhere to the skin a lot better.
There's everything for the well-dressed embalmer.
This is an ideal outfit for embalming. It's got all the protective gear and coating so as to keep any diseases or anything like that off you and away from the skin.
It's all a far cry from the days when funeral directors like the Little family in Auckland exuded black-tailed dignity. But the small high street premises are no longer. Things have changed here too. Now the Little family have a spacious, modern, one-stop shop that offers everything from chapel service and celebrant to lunch and tea for the bereaved. Is it less dignified than the old days? Are they just chasing the dollar? The Littles say not.
You're looking at a unique industry where we provide a 7-day-a-week service, 24 hours a day, 365 days of the year, and we have to be able to sort of answer a phone call, and normally it's done within the hour. And to do that thing, and this is the aspect where people don't appreciate what's involved in that figure at the bottom of the account.
What's involved now in New Zealand too is more consumer choice.
So what I've created is an egg.
There are memorial eggs to hold that secret keepsake.
It can be maybe a wedding band, maybe a token of ashes, maybe something significant, a locket, a chain, even grandfather's cufflinks.
And compared with half a century ago, more and better embalming. New Zealand funeral directors claim to be among the best in the world at this deadly art. They can even do computer-generated graphics for your headstone. But all this funeral paraphernalia doesn't mean we too are becoming Americanized. These are not the cloud cuckoo trappings of gracious dying, according to the industry.
Like everything else, technology gets involved with funeral services as well. Our hearses are no longer horse-drawn, you may have noticed. You say that it's paraphernalia. I see it simply as being something that helps us do our job.
In fact, one of the biggest changes has seen funerals become simpler and cheaper. In the days of the horse-drawn carriage, 3/4 of us were buried. These days, almost 3/4 are cremated. Even the gravediggers are converts.
I'll probably get cremated too, yeah.
Why?
Well, yeah, cleaner and that, tidier.
You want to be clean and tidy in death?
Yeah.
With cremation, there's no need to buy an expensive plot in a cemetery. You can be burned for around $135. The coffin's extra, of course. And no, they don't hold the coffins back to reuse them. And yes, what goes into the cremator is precisely what comes out the other end. The true ashes, and nothing but the true ashes. ground down in a cremulator until they're fine enough to fit into a small container. So the funeral industry in New Zealand is adapting. Most importantly, if we want to compete with overseas-owned companies, we're beginning to get into the pre-need market. The Funeral Directors Association of New Zealand has started advertising prepaid funerals. With some success, it's already sold around $20 million worth, most of that in the last 5 years. So do funeral directors here have the marketing drive to compete against the Americans, to combat the almost inevitable pre-need sales push?
Certainly be competed against, and FDANZ will certainly raise its profile in terms of its own plan, but not at the expense of the ethics of our association members.
It's not just the association that's ready to take on the Americans at pre-need. Competition could come from the most unlikely places. In Kawakawa, Tom Murray is opening his second home, thanks to a uniquely Māori version of prepaid funerals. Murray's clients pay $35 a year while they're living. In exchange, they're guaranteed a funeral when they die.
I'm not a millionaire, but $35, I'm not going to miss that.
Many of Murray's clients are beneficiaries and entitled to a government funeral grant of just over $1,000. The grant, plus their annual payment, gives them their funeral free. If you join the scheme, or kaupapa, just before you die, you get a particularly good deal.
Yes, you do. We've had many of those. In the last 2.5 to 3 years, we've done over 650 funerals, and many of those have only been on our kaupapa for maybe a week, a month, and we've carried out their funeral services, saving them hundreds of dollars. They don't have to dip into their pocket to actually pay for funeral directors' services.
Tangi are usually cheaper for funeral directors. The whānau dig the grave. Some want Pākehā to follow suit. Father Jim Considine has a group called the Funeral Choice Collective, dedicated to do-it-yourself death care.
I think very few people would know that they could actually do the whole funeral without a funeral director, for example, as we have done. We recently had a funeral in Christchurch where we had talked to the deceased family and the woman who died before she died. We had friends who laid her out, who were nurses, and then we had a couple of friends of mine had built a coffin, so we brought that in and she was placed in that. We had ceremonies and prayer. We placed her in the back of the station wagon, made sure she was well strapped in, and put our headlights on and drove to the cemetery. And after those prayers there, we filled the grave in and went back home for a small celebration.
If you talk to some people, they say that in some cases funeral directors get in the way.
There is within the New Zealand funeral industry now a strong ethic amongst funeral directors to help people to help themselves. I have seen time and time again funeral directors showing families what they can do for themselves, and those families going off, whether it be in their own station wagon, taking part in the funeral rituals, the carrying of the casket themselves to the graveside with no funeral director present, with the funeral director offering the help and staying in the background as you suggest.
The Funeral Directors Association is playing it cool. The president says his industry is in good heart, full of new ideas, ready to meet the future. Even the stories from the States of hard-nosed rip-off merchants fail to faze him.
I'm sure that just as in every other business and profession, there are rip-off merchants. In America, that may be the case. I have read the articles by Jessica Mitford and her book, and a number of consumer articles that indicate directors. And I don't believe that that is the shape of funeral service in America as a whole.
The official line from the funeral directors is that we can greet the arrival of the Americans with a smile. At the end of their 60th Jubilee convention, the undertakers showed every appearance of gay abandon. Appearances, as we know, can be deceptive, but for the moment they're hoping they won't be swamped by 20th century American pap culture.
Since
Since that report was filmed, there's been a change at the top at Stewart Enterprises. The man who set up the company's New Zealand connection, the head of funeral services of Australasia, Andrew McEachran, has left the company. There's been no word yet on who will replace him.